answering because they don't even exist.
Eventually, the Office of Personnel Management informed agencies last night that responding to the email was voluntary and failure to respond would not, quote, equate to resignation. But Musk seems undaunted, saying last night workers will be given another chance, adding failure to respond a second time will result in termination. Joining me now to discuss, Leah Wright-Rigueur, CNN political analyst and historian, Kendra Barkoff, former press secretary to Joe Biden, and Brad Todd, CNN political commentator and Republican strategist. Kendra, first off, what's the harm in responding to this email with a few innocuous bullet points about what you did that doesn't betray client or customer information?
The harm is the overall thing of what Elon Musk and Donald Trump are doing. This is not about exactly what they're asking for. This is about power. This is about control. And this is about causing mass chaos within a government who is supposed to be doing certain things. Veterans, the Veterans Administration are supposed to be giving out what they deserve to get to their veterans. This is about causing chaos in the administration. And at the end of the day, who is responsible for this? You're already seeing some of the cabinet secretaries push back on this. There's a sense of just undue chaos, and this is all about the power. That
OPM memo that CNN obtained essentially sent to HR department saying this is voluntary. If you don't respond, you're not going to have to resign or be fired. You would expect, Brad, that that's going to be a major exhibit in a forthcoming lawsuit if, in fact, workers are fired as a result of this.
Well, it will. But in the end, what they're trying to get to is they're trying to force federal government employees to declare, do you agree that you work for the White House and the President of the United States or not? Or do you think you're entitled to just do what you want? There's been this arrogance in the federal bureaucracy for a long time. People think they're going to stay there forever. They don't take orders from the White House. They don't take orders from maybe even anyone. And I think that they're trying to shine a light on that arrogance and force some sort of accountability so that the federal bureaucracy admits that it works for the elected leadership of the government.
Well, I think there's some pause about whether these workers believe they work for Elon Musk, whether they work for Doge, who's calling the shots here. And to be sure, a judge did issue a 14-day temporary restraining order on Doge's ability to access some of these more sensitive systems. But, Leah, you're a historian. Put this into context for us. Every administration has tried to cut costs in some manner. So how does this differ, in your view?
So every administration has not only tried to cut costs, they've also tried to cut the federal bureaucracy. And in fact, they've been pretty successful at doing it. Bill Clinton is a great example of this. Over the course of his 2 terms in office, he cut close to 500,000 people from the federal budget and, saved millions of dollars. And it was explicitly about efficiency and getting rid of waste and fraud. However, he did it in a very specific manner. There was a task force that was led by Al Gore. It had 400 people on it. And so they would identify very carefully over the course of 8 years, who are these people? What are they doing? And then we have very human conversations to limit the kind of harm that we are doing, because these are real people with real lives that also have details, very sensitive and important information. The goal is not to cause chaos, which actually helps inefficiency. And so one of the things that we should be looking at, and the way that we should be trying to understand Dodge, is that even as it is accounting for waste and bureaucracy and mismanagement and things like that, it is actually exacerbating those problems. So we should be evaluating that, and what are they doing, and how are they actually helping fraud or not helping fraud.
Well, in this case, Elon Musk, as a special government employee, only has 130 days to affect his own agenda and get his goals accomplished. Perhaps one of the reasons why this has been moving so quickly. That's led some lawmakers to urge him to use more compassion, and to the administration more broadly to approach this in a more compassionate way, which President Trump himself addressed from the White House yesterday. Here's what he said.
Elon uses the expression caring. If we had people that cared, just cared a little bit when they did contracts, when they negotiated with outside vendors on behalf of the United States. That's what I'm doing now. I'm negotiating for the people of the United States. So we're doing a great job of it.
So the idea that more care should have been exercised when these contracts were being inked, or these workers were being hired, or these divisions were being set up, Kendra, your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Glenn Youngkin was out there yesterday talking about the empathy that he has for the workers in his state. There's probably, I think, around 100,000 federal workers in the state of Virginia. He's out there talking about, this is really hard. People need to plan. People need to have lives. People have children. And it is something that Republicans should take into account. You're also seeing this not just outside of the D.C. area. You're seeing it in town halls across the country where Republicans are going out there and talking to their constituents. And they're hearing from their constituents that this is a problem. This chaos is causing a problem, not just in the D.C. area, but everywhere.
You mentioned what Governor Youngkin said. I just want to play that before we get our panel's response. Here's the governor yesterday.
We need to press forward and drive efficiencies in our federal government. And as a result of driving those efficiencies, I do expect that some Virginians will lose their jobs. And that's why it's so important that we provide alternative opportunities for them.
Alternative opportunities for them, Brad. Virginia has a very robust economy. There are a lot of companies headquartered there. What is the down ballot effect in states that might not have such a robust economy, that might not have so many large blue chip employers there?
Well, we've seen this kind of disruption due to government policy before. I've come from a place that was manufacturing based, and NAFTA and PNTR just devastated it. A lot of those people lost their jobs. People I know, they had to move to different areas. They had to move to a different place where there were more opportunities, maybe a more booming metropolitan area. So but luckily, the government workers in Washington, D.C. are probably not going to have to relocate. Washington's a booming economy, and there's always work for people who are educated and have skills, and that's the kind of people that might lose their job in the federal government.
Do you expect an exodus out of Washington? What have we seen in the past?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to understand about Washington is the cost of living in Washington. And what have we seen in the past is that by and large, when administrations change, we do see people move out of those spaces. So we're starting to see a trickle down in terms of real estate, in terms of what's going on the market. That also may be natural, given that it's starting to be spring. I'm being aspirational here. But we're also seeing a transition between administrations. What I would be very careful about, though, is that there is a difference in how we are seeing the kind of explosion or transition, because it's not simply political appointees that we're seeing leave right now. We're seeing en masse these kind of much larger layoffs that affect career and civil employees who normally have not been part of these large mass layoffs that have happened so intimately and so fast. That is absolutely going to have an effect on the economy, both the economy within Washington, D.C., but larger economies that are dependent upon or have been integrated into the conversation around the federal government. The federal government plays an important role in the economy, and it's one that I think we've really overlooked in this larger conversation.
And there's a lot of institutional knowledge walking out of the building as well with that, too. This conversation will continue, but coming up on CNN.